They thought they could cut his water and silence him. What they didn't know, he owned the lake feeding the entire mountain. This isn't just a story about revenge, it's about power and patience, and the moment one man shut off a town to turn the truth back on. Let's begin story. Point 1. The silence in the pipes. It happened on a bitterly cold Wednesday morning, the kind where the frost paints your windows and your breath curls like smoke even indoors. Eleanor was mid-shampoo in our upstairs bathroom, her only bathroom, when she screamed my name with a panic I'd never heard in her voice before. Not the kind of scream you hear when someone drops a glass or sees a spider, but the kind that seizes your heart in a vice and forces your legs to move before your brain catches up. I was in the workshop, sanding a piece of red oak for a cabinet project, when I dropped everything and bolted into the house. By the time I reached her, she was standing in the tub, shivering, her auburn hair thick with white suds and a towel wrapped hastily around her shoulders. Her eyes were red not from tears, but from soap she couldn't rinse out. "There's no water," she choked, blinking furiously. "Nothing, no hot, no cold, it just stopped." I turned the knobs on the faucet beside her. Nothing, no sputter, no drip, just a hollow silence that made my stomach tighten. We rushed downstairs. I tried the kitchen sink, bone dry, then the mudroom tap, nothing. I ran outside into the crisp air and tested the outdoor spigot near the greenhouse. Dry as dust. It wasn't a frozen pipe at this time of year, and it wasn't a pressure issue either. It was deliberate, sudden, total. I grabbed my coat and boots and crunched through the snow toward the front of our property. That's when I saw it, a metal stake plunged deep into the ground next to our water access junction, with a bright red tag flapping violently in the wind. A pipe, cleanly severed and capped, protruded from the ground like a finger pointing at my house in accusation. Attached to the stake was a laminated warning from the High Peak Estates Homeowners Association. Notice of termination and authorized connection to community water network. Action taken by order of HOA President Karen. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore, it had reached inside me. My first instinct was confusion, then rage. The kind of rage that makes your jaw clench and your vision narrow, that drowns out the sound of the wind and fills your ears with blood. We weren't behind on our dues. We hadn't tapped into anything we weren't entitled to. If anything, the opposite was true. As I stood there in the snow, Alana came out in a bathrobe, her hair still foamy, her eyes wide and furious. "Who the hell does this?" she whispered, without even telling us. I looked down at the severed pipe, then up at the red tag, and I knew one thing for certain: whoever had made this decision didn't know what they were messing with. Because what they didn't realize was that the crystal-clear alpine lake that fed every pipe in this mountain community wasn't theirs to claim. It was mine. And they had just cut off the only house with a legal right to it. Point 2. The reservoir revelation. By the time I got Elena settled with bottled water and a ragged towel over her eyes, the adrenaline was giving way to something colder than the snow outside: clarity. The HOA hadn't just made a clerical error. They'd physically come onto my land and cut the primary water supply line. That wasn't policy enforcement. That was sabotage. I called the HOA office, no answer. I texted the property manager, left on read. I sent an email to the general inbox with the subject line: "Immediate response required, a legal action taken." Nothing. Radio silence. That's when I realized this wasn't just carelessness. This was intentional, targeted, and worse, authorized. My boots hit the pavement with purpose. I marched down the winding forest road toward the HOA administrative cabin, a fancy name for what was basically a converted toolshed at the end of a cul-de-sac. The sun was beginning to rise higher now, casting long, silver shadows across the snowdrifts. My breath puffed out like warning smoke. Inside the cabin sat Karen, the infamous HOA president, at a desk 3 sizes too big for the room, sipping herbal tea like she was royalty in exile. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "You cut my water line," I said flatly. She glanced up, lips curled in a faint smirk. "It was an unauthorized connection. The board made a unanimous decision." "Did the board check the water rights records first?" I asked. She paused, blinked once, then leaned back in her chair. "We don't need to. All land beyond the main perimeter is considered part of the communal resource zone. No one owns the water." I stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and placed a sealed manila envelope on her desk. "That's where you're wrong. That lake you've been pulling from for years, the one you've piped into every home in this neighborhood, I bought it 6 years ago, along with the reservoir feeding it, and the legal easement that runs under your precious cul-de-sac, mine. Her expression froze for the first time. That's impossible. I shook my head. No, what's impossible is the fact that I've let you tap into my reservoir for free, without complaint, for all these years. And now you've severed my connection to my own water, with no notice, no hearing, no investigation, just a smug little sign in the snow. She reached for the envelope with fingers that weren't quite steady. This doesn't change the fact that your pipe wasn't approved by the homeowner. Karen, I said, lowering my voice to a calm, dangerous whisper, your entire community drinks from my lake. And you just cut the line to the only house with the legal right to it. I turned to leave, letting the words hang in there like the warning crack of a glacier splitting. I wasn't bluffing, and she had no idea the avalanche she'd just triggered. Point 3. The weight of the valve. Back at the cabin, I opened the safe beneath my desk, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were the documents most people would have overlooked as nothing specially glowing: copies of land surveys, faded county maps, and a thick folder labeled Silver Basin Holdings. But nestled between those dusty records was the crown jewel, the deed to the Alpine Ridge Reservoir. 6 years ago, I'd bought that slice of land thinking it was a serene Escopia glacial-fed bowl tucked between two peaks, quiet and untouched. Locals had thought the small lake was unimportant, just runoff from the old mining valley. But I knew better. I'd done the hydrology research. The underground aquifer that fed that lake was deep, stable, and pure, perfect for a long-term homestead. It was why I built here in the first place. What I didn't know back then was that the High Peak Estates homeowner, desperate to lower costs after the county water utility jacked up rates, had secretly rerouted a pumping system years ago to tap into the reservoir. They never told the new homeowners, and they sure as hell never asked me. I didn't say anything at the time. My own access line was separate, and I didn't care. I figured it was doing more good than harm, and honestly, I liked the quiet. But now, they'd made it personal. Karen had swung a bureaucratic hammer at a hornet's nest without checking what was inside. I called my attorney, Nolan. He was direct and efficient former water rights specialist for the state, now semi-retired and running a law practice out of Durango. Within minutes, he confirmed what I already knew. I owned not just the reservoir, but the exclusive supply rights, protected by a pre-ho easement. If any external entity violated the terms, I was authorized to restrict, reroute, or terminate access, legally, irrevocably. You have them by the throat, Nolan said, and they don't even realize it. I hung up and drove the snow-packed trail that led to the intake station, an unassuming fenced area hidden in the woods, where twin pumps thrummed quietly beneath a camouflage tarp. I brushed away the snow and opened the padlocked control box. Inside was the master valve, polished brass, thick and unyielding, and next to it, a small keypad controlling a modern digital timer system I'd installed 2 summers ago. One press of a button, and the entire neighborhood would go dry. I stood there, wind howling through the trees, my fingers hovering over the control panel, my breath clouded in the air like smoke from a waiting gun. I didn't touch the valve. Not yet. No, this wasn't the time for rage. I needed them to feel what they'd done. And when the pain hit, it wouldn't come from a burst pipe or a city citation, it would come from the mountain itself. Because when you cut off a man from his water in the Rockies, you're not just flipping the switch. You're cracking the ice. Point 4, a party worth the pain. I didn't close the valve that day. Not because I lacked the will, but because I understood something Karen never would. Timing is everything. You don't fire your shot when the target is armored. You wait until they parade themselves in front of a crowd, beaming with false authority, completely unaware the floor beneath them is about to collapse. So I waited. I returned to the house and let Elena know what I had planned, at least part of it. She looked at me, soap finally washed from her eyes, and simply nodded. Make them feel it, she said. By the next morning, the community app was buzzing with HOA chatter. Karen had posted a glowing announcement, practically giddy, about an upcoming Mountain Spring Festival scheduled for that weekend. It was a neighborhood-wide event with food trucks, a chili cook-off, a bouncy castle, and this was the part that made me laugh out loud, a fire hose tug of war. But the real kicker, a massive snowmelt water slide for the kids and a mock ice plunge in plastic tubs filled with pumped water. A full-blown water-themed celebration. right in the middle of the drought-prone mountain basin, and right after she cut the only lawful pipe feeding that water to begin with. I could practically hear the gum caulking. Karen even uploaded a selfie standing by the still broken pipe outside my property, captioned, "No freeloaders in High Peak." Hoa takes water theft seriously. She wore a smug grin, her whole badge clipped to a neon windbreaker like it gave her divine authority. The comments were a predictable mix of applause and confusion. A few neighbors cheered her on. Others asked cautiously, "Wait, where does the water come from again?" One or two even tagged me, but I stayed silent. Silence is power when you know a storm's coming. Instead, I posted a single image the next day, a high-res photo of my deed and water rights agreement, embossed with the county seal, time-stamped, notarized, and signed. The caption read, "Funny thing about alpine lakes, when you own them, you decide who gets to drink." It detonated across the app in minutes. My phone buzzed nonstop. Some neighbors messaged me in shock, others in support, a few in denial. But the seed was planted, and the roots were already cracking the foundation of Karen's flimsy reign. Still, I didn't act, not yet, because the show was just beginning. I spent Friday preparing the control box, setting the timer, 1 p.m. sharp, right as the festival kicked into full swing. Right when the dunk tank needed refilling and kids were screaming for one more slide down the mountain of plastic and water. I wasn't just going to make a point. I was going to let them host the party, drink from my well, splash in my lake's lifeblood, and then I'd shut it off. Not to destroy them, but to teach them the weight of what they'd taken for granted. And when the faucets went dry, and the hoses sputtered, and the panic spread, they wouldn't be angry at me. They'd remember exactly who turned the wheel. Point 5. The day the mountain held its breath. Saturday dawned bright and merciless. The kind of high-altitude sunshine that made every frost-covered pine sparkle like it was dipped in glass. It was the perfect day for a party. And the perfect day for a reckoning. I sat on the porch of my cabin with a thermos of black coffee, watching SUVs and hatchbacks roll into the community meadow down the slope. From up here, the field looked festive as streamers fluttered, kids darted between inflatable tunnels, and 3 food trucks lined the snowy perimeter, their grills puffing into the mountain air like contented dragons. But it wasn't the food or the music that caught my attention. It was the water. Coils of blue and green hose snaked from the whole utility shed to the play areas. I could see a sprinkler rig misting down the vinyl water slide. Somewhere, a generator hummed, powering coolers and a portable fountain they'd set up near the welcome table. The snowmelt plunge tanks were filling slow but steadily. Every drop pulled from my lake, every hose running on stolen rights. And Karen, she was everywhere, wearing mirrored sunglasses and a bright red scarf. She paraded across the grounds like she was hosting a televised holiday parade. She posed for photos beside the dunk tank, high-fived toddlers, and even barked orders at the DJ, adjusting the volume like she owned the very sound waves. Several neighbors gave me cautious waves when they saw me watching from my porch. A few looked away. One even offered a sheepish thumbs up, unsure whether I was the villain of this story or the man holding the last card. At 12:45 p.m., I walked into my cabin, entered the security code on the tablet mounted to the wall, and opened the remote valve interface. The digital timer ticked down, 0 hours 15 minutes and 0 seconds. I waited, not with anger, but with the heavy calm of someone who knows gravity will do its job once the boulder's off the ledge. 1 p.m. I tapped the screen. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There was no explosion, no seismic shift. Just a subtle shift in pressure like the mountain itself had exhaled. Down below, it took maybe 2 minutes. The dunk tank stopped filling. A boy slipped halfway down the slide and yelped when the vinyl burned his legs. Parents shouted for more water. Hoses fizzled. Faucets ran air. Confusion spread like fire through dry brush. One mom ran to the water table, shook the cooler, then shouted, "Why is nothing working?" Then someone checked their phone and screamed. The houses, the cabins, the entire community tree. Karen's face transformed in real time from smug delight to twitching disbelief. She stomped toward the main utility shed, yelling at a volunteer who looked like he wanted to disappear into the snow. I watched her grab her walkie-talkie, bark orders into it like it would summon a miracle. It didn't. The fire marshal, who happened to be a resident, walked up beside her, arms crossed, expression stone cold. He asked what backup plan she had for the sudden outage. Karen stammered something about a system hiccup. That's when I rose from my chair. I walked calmly down the gravel trail, through the crowd, and up to the main waterline junction near the dunk tank. The entire festival paused, like someone had hit mute on the world. I raised my voice and not a yell, just enough to carry. The lake you're all pulling from, I own it. The pipe you cut last week, it was the only one that had a legal claim. Today's water outages and sabotage, it's a correction. Then I held up a laminated copy of the deed. Silence. One of the kids dropped a water balloon that never exploded. It hit the frozen grass and rolled like a deflated joke. Karen opened her mouth, closed it. And just like that, the mountain knew. Point 6. The cracks in the crown. By Sunday morning, the crisp mountain air carried something heavier than snow or silence. It carried embarrassment. Gone were the sounds of sprinkler valves clicking to life, children yelling from their yards, or the quiet thrum of heat exchangers humming under crawl spaces. Instead, High Peak Estates woke up to a kind of hush usually reserved for cemeteries or courtrooms. Every home, every cabinetry, and every homeowner now fully aware of why. The group app had gone from party photos to pandemonium. The celebratory posts from the day before had aged like spoiled milk. Screenshots of my deed circulated, along with blurry video clips of Karen pacing in front of the utility shed, visibly rattled. Someone had even edited one clip into a meme of her standing next to the lifeless dunk tank, captioned, "When you cut the pipe but forget who owns the mountain." That one hit the local forums within hours. Karen, once the iron-fisted enforcer of curtain colors and trash bin etiquette, had vanished from every thread. Not a comment, not a rebuttal, just digital smoke where her authority used to stand. But her silence only poured fuel on the fire. Dozens of messages flooded my inbox, neighbors asking if the lake story was true, if I really had the right to shut off their supply, if I'd be turning it back on. I gave every one of them the same answer: I'm not here to punish anyone. I just want the pipe repaired, an apology issued, and my rights respected. That's it. Some understood, some pleaded, a few cursed me for what they called water terrorism, but it didn't matter. The facts were immovable. Like the granite beneath the reservoir, the Hoa had trespassed. They tampered with protected infrastructure, and now they were watching their power crack, one pipe at a time. By noon, I received a phone call from someone I didn't expect. Deputy Lau Brent, a local sheriff's deputy who'd been working the region for years. Friendly guy, big mustache. He chuckled when I picked up. "Hey Lars," he said. "You'll never guess who came marching into the station this morning demanding we arrest you for weaponizing water." I didn't need to guess. Karen. Lau went on to tell me that she had stormed in waving her clipboard, claiming I'd endangered the community, manipulated Hoa assets, and abused natural resources. She had even printed screenshots of my post like she was delivering court evidence. The sheriff listened quietly, reviewed the documents I'd submitted weeks ago. I had already filed everything in advance, and then calmly informed her that not only had I broken no law, but she might be facing charges of her own for unauthorized utility tampering and trespassing. Karen left in a fury, threatening to contact the county commissioner, or maybe the governor. Lau just left. "She looked like someone threw her throne into the lake," he said. But the day's real punch came after sunset. An alert flashed across my motion sensors, one set up near the reservoir's intake valve. I opened the app and watched, eyebrows lifting. A man in a hoodie was crouching at the fence, clumsy, nervous. He fumbled with a pair of bolt cutters, glancing over his shoulder like he'd seen too many spy movies. I zoomed in. Todd, Karen's brother-in-law, the guy who once tried to pave a driveway without a permit and ended up cracking his neighbor's foundation, a walking mess. I called the sheriff immediately. Deputy Lau arrived within 10 minutes, caught Todd red-handed still fiddling with the lock on the valve shed. When I got there, Todd was sitting on a folding chair beside the floodlights, face red, muttering about just trying to help the neighborhood. Karen showed up minutes later, coat open, hair disheveled, eyes wide when she saw him cuffed. She tried to play it cool, claiming Todd had acted alone, but he'd already spilled everything. She told him to just fix it before the Monday board meeting. Lyle took statements. Todd was let off with a warning and a court date. Karen, however, received a written citation for inciting unauthorized access to private infrastructure. The empire wasn't just cracking anymore. It was sinking. Point 7. The fall of the paper queen. The Monday night emergency whole meeting was supposed to be behind closed doors. Karen had made that clear in the announcement she'd posted mid-afternoon, calling it a board-only strategy session to restore community stability. But the damage had already spread too far, too fast. People weren't just upset, they were furious. And when the new vice president, a quiet older man named George Tillman, publicly declined to attend unless the meeting was open to all residents, the whole facade collapsed. So it became public. Held in the old ski lodge turned community center at the bottom of the valley, the meeting room was standing room only. Folding chairs scraped against wooden floors. Snow melted from boots pulled near the door. The air buzzed with tension, not the kind born from confusion, but from awakening. I arrived quietly, slipping into the back row. No dramatic entrance, no flash of purposed presence, but whispers followed me like wind through the rafters. Some neighbors nodded. Others gave tight-lipped, embarrassed looks. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Karen stood at the front like a woman trying to keep a crumbling dam from bursting. Her signature clipboard was clutched in one hand like a shield. Her scarf was tied tight at the neck like a noose she didn't yet know she was wearing. She launched into a speech. Predictable, stiff. She framed the recent events as a miscommunication rooted in outdated records. She claimed the water rights issue had been poorly documented, insisted that the severed pipe was a necessary precaution to prevent misuse of shared resources. She never used my name. She didn't need to. But I stood up anyway. Someone handed me the mic. Karen stiffened, eyes narrowing. I walked to the front, not to confront but to confirm, and I laid it all out, piece by piece. I started with the deed projected clearly on the wall using the old overhead. I showed the county stamp, the ownership dates, the highlighted section on the easement that specifically granted me supply control. I held up the incident report filed by Deputy Bren, outlining the sabotage attempt by Todd Wilbur and Karen's admitted encouragement. Then came the final blow. I played the camera footage, a grainy, motion-activated video of Todd sneaking around my reservoir's intake, fumbling with bolt cutters, and getting caught in the act. Karen's voice could be heard faintly in the background of the sheriff's body cam footage, protesting. I didn't tell him to break in. When the clip ended, the room was dead silent. Then, from the back, someone let out a single, sharp laugh, and honest. Others joined in, not mockery, not cruelty, just the sound of realization. Karen's eyes darted across the crowd, looking for allies, but there were none. George stood, his chair scraping across the floor, and addressed the board. I moved to remove Karen Wilbur from her position as whole president, effective immediately. Someone seconded it before he even finished the sentence. The vote was unanimous. No abstentions. Not even Karen raised her hand. She stood still for a second, then gathered her clipboard like a failed general retreating from her last battlefield. She didn't speak. She didn't apologize. She just walked out, her boots clicking across the floor like punctuation marks on a very final sentence. Afterward, the newly appointed interim president, a kind-hearted woman named Lena Ortega, who had never liked drama but had always shown up to rake leaves at the park, approached me personally. "We're so sorry," she said. "It should have never gotten this far." I nodded. "We'll repair the pipe," she promised. "Properly, with your oversight. And if you'll allow it, we'd like to discuss a formal water usage agreement, one that respects the lake and your rights." I looked at her for a moment, the tension in my shoulders slowly unwinding. "Good," I said, "because the next flood won't be water, it'll be lawsuits." And just like that, the war was over. The healing could begin. Point 8. The turning of the valve. The next morning, the snow on the mountaintops began to melt just a little faster. Maybe it was the sun, maybe it was the symbolism, but either way by noon, I stood once more at the reservoir intake, valve key in hand. The new whole board had followed through immediately. They issued a printed apology slipped under every door in Hypicus acknowledging the legal pipe cut, confirming my ownership of the reservoir, and committing to a new community charter that prevented future tampering of private utilities. It was direct, honest, humble. Elena framed our copy like it was a diploma. But this wasn't just about a pipe anymore. It was about the principle behind it, the resource they'd misused, the respect they'd abandoned, and the responsibility they'd forgotten came with authority. I slid the key into the master valve and turned. There was a low, metallic groan, followed by a hiss as the water surged into the system. Gauges spun, dials stabilized, and the pumps thrummed to life, steady and powerful. I stood still for a moment, listening to the pressure equalize through the lines, as though the mountain itself was sighing in relief. Within minutes, defects rippled outward. Lawns began to darken with moisture. Faucets sputtered back to life. The sprinkler at the Miller cabin chirped once before launching into its familiar rhythm. From my porch, I could hear a child cheer as water finally returned to their tap, followed by a yell of "Mom, the toilet works again." And just like that, the town exhaled. But I wasn't finished. Later that week, I sat down with Lena and the rest of the new board to draft a formal water usage agreement, this time in writing, signed, sealed, and filed with the county. It laid out everything: how much water could be drawn, under what conditions, for what purposes, and who was responsible for maintenance. There were no loopholes, no vague assumptions. I added one clause: just for me, any proposed changes to shared infrastructure require written notice and approval 30 days in advance. No more surprises. No more midnight sabotage. They agreed without hesitation. Then came the final touch. I hired a local landscaping crew to install a modest stone fountain in front of the horrified same converted cabin where Karen once ruled like a queen. Nothing gaudy, nothing flashy. Just a tiered stack of alpine stone with water trickling down in a quiet, continuous rhythm. At its base, I installed a bronze plaque that read, "Water is a shared gift. Respect the source." Most residents smiled when they saw it. A few took selfies. One woman who used to avoid eye contact handed me a tin of homemade cookies and said, "Thank you for not turning this into a war." But Karen, she never showed. Until, one afternoon, a white sedan pulled up to our gate. A courier stepped out, handed me a padded envelope, and left without a word. Inside was a postcard, a stock photo of a desert sunset. No return address, just a scrawl in cramped, looping handwriting. "Enjoy your lake, Lord of the Pipes. I've moved onto where people know who's in charge, Ike." I flipped it over, smirked, and walked down to the edge of my lake. I skipped a rock across the surface, watching it bounce 3 times before sinking. She still didn't get it. This was never about control. It was about stewardship. And she'd lost because she never learned the difference. Point 9. The reservoir becomes a mirror. With Karen out of the picture and the water flowing again, High Peak Estates began to transform, not just in plumbing, but in spirit. The snow lingered on the ridgelines, but spring had started to stretch its fingers into the valley. And for the first time since we'd moved here, the neighborhood actually started to feel like a community. Lena and the board followed through on every promise. They replaced the severed pipe with a new, reinforced line, this time with a flow meter I could monitor remotely. I didn't ask for that part. They insisted. Trust, they said, had to be measured and felt. But the changes weren't just bureaucratic. We organized the first Lake Day cleanup to weekends after the meeting. What started as 5 families with gloves and trash bags turned into a full event. Kids raced along the trail with nets, pulling old fishing line and plastic wrappers from the reservoir's edge. Parents laid out picnic blankets and shared thermoses of cider and chili. Even George Tillman brought down his battered guitar and played softly by the water. What had once been seen as just a lake became something people cared about. And that, more than any vote or legal document, was the real shift. The woman who used to be fined for painting her shutters sage green, she now led the beautification committee, turning eyesores into flower beds. The man who once got cited for using a non-regulation mailbox hosted open bonfires every Friday night, blew marshmallows. The old hoe rules weren't gone, but they'd been rewritten. Shorter, clearer, kinder. Still, the past wasn't entirely buried. Occasionally, someone would make a joke about the water wars. They'd ask if I still had my hand on the valve. I'd just smile and say, no. But I still know where the wrench is. Even the kids picked up on the legacy. One day while I was checking the irrigation sensors near the intake line, I caught 2 teenagers sneaking up the trail, clearly trying to get a closer look. They froze when they saw me. "I'm not gonna yell," I said. "Come here." I showed them the intake valve, explained how it worked, how the water traveled down through 3 separate lines, how we tracked pressure, flow, even temperature. One of them, a girl with tangled braids and a notebook, asked the question I knew was coming. "Did you really shut off the whole town's water, just to prove a point?" I smiled. No, I shut it off because someone crossed a line they had no right to. And because sometimes, the only way to teach people respect is to let them feel what happens when it's missing. They didn't say much after that. Just nodded and walked back down the trail a little slower than before. I stood there a while, listening to the water rushing through the pipes beneath my boots. Karen had thought power came from policies, from signs and threats and clipboards. She thought a badge gave her the right to decide who mattered. But real power, it isn't about control. It's about choosing not to use it until absolutely necessary, and then using it with purpose. Because when you steward something essential like water, or trust, you don't get to rule over people. You get to serve them, even when they forget who you are. Especially then. Point 10. The echo of the mountain. Months passed, and the tension that had once gripped High Peak estates melted away like spring snow on granite. The sprinklers clicked on in the mornings without a second thought. Laughter returned to backyards, and neighbors no longer peered over their fences with suspicion. The ghost of Karen's regime still lingered mostly in horror stories swapped during barbecues, but the fear she ruled with was gone. The silence of dry taps had become legend, and with it, the story of how one man turned off a town to make it listen. I didn't seek attention. I never wanted a pedestal. All I wanted was peace to live by my lake, build cabinets in my workshop, and wake each morning to the ripple of water instead of the rustle of legal threats. But stories have a way of escaping. A few months after the shutdown, I got a formal letter. Not from the not from a lawyer, but from the Regional Homeowners Association Council. They were organizing a conference for community leaders, planners, and infrastructure managers across the state, and they wanted me to speak on a panel. At first, I laughed. Me, a guest speaker. But then I thought about how many neighborhoods were ruled by unchecked power, how many Karens in khaki jackets were swinging clipboards like swords. Maybe it was time someone told the truth. So, I went. The conference was held in a sprawling civic center just outside Denver. Suits everywhere, lanyards, laser pointers, and PowerPoint decks. But when it came time for my panel, I didn't bring slides. I brought the story. I told them everything, from the cup pipe and the smug sign in the snow, to the party where the water ran dry. I told them about the fountain, the cleanup days, the kids with nets, and the plaque in front of the Hoe office. But most of all, I told them about the valve, not just the physical one, but the metaphorical one we all hold. The choice we make between control and stewardship, silence and responsibility. And when I was done, they clapped. Some approached afterward to shake my hand. A few shared their own baptismal wars over bird feeders, flagpoles, and sidewalk chalk. Most just wanted to know, how do you stop things from getting that far? You can, I said. Not always, but you can draw the line early. And you can make sure that when someone crosses it, they understand there's no going back. When I returned home, there was a sign waiting at the lake trailhead. Wooden, hand-painted, crooked in the sweetest way. Welcome to Peace Lake. Take only what you need. Give back what you can. One of the neighborhood kids had made it, probably the one with the notebook. I stood there, when tugging gently at my coat, and smiled. Not because I'd won. This was never about winning. It was about fixing what had been broken. Karen's name faded from the neighborhood slowly. Last I heard, she'd moved to a stricter hoe in southern Utah. Tried running for president again. Lost by a landslide. The lake, Thummy Lake, was more than just a water source now. It was a symbol, a line in the snow. And every time I walked its edge, every time I heard the soft hum of the pump station, I knew one thing for certain. Power isn't in the switch. It's in knowing when not to flip it. And that's a lesson the mountain would remember long after the clipboards were gone. Valuable lesson. True authority is not measured by how much power you hold, but by how responsibly you choose to wield it. This story isn't just about water rights or whole politics. It's about the consequences of unchecked power, the importance of legal foresight, and the strength of calm, principled resistance. The narrator had every opportunity to lash out, to retaliate immediately, or to escalate the conflict through rage, but instead, he chose patience, precision, and integrity. When leaders act out of ego instead of empathy, they often forget that real leadership is about stewardship, not domination. Karen's downfall wasn't just due to her poor judgment. It was her belief that control gave her the right to ignore fairness, ownership, and dialogue. That belief collapsed the moment someone stood up, not with noise, but with truth, documents, and timing. The story teaches us that doing what is right, even when you're wronged, can have a deeper and more lasting impact than revenge ever could. And sometimes, the most powerful statement isn't made by shouting. It's made by knowing exactly when to turn the valve.